Hi, everybody. All right, we're going to keep this sweet and succinct. Make sure you're in the right place. Crazy web performance with Azure Static Web Apps. I'm a huge fan of the clickbait titles. We're not really going to talk about crazy web performance. We are going to talk about Azure Static Web Apps, which is one of my favorite tools in my toolbox. And since I only have 25 minutes, I want to just be short and sweet and show you some cool stuff that you can go use now. So hi, I'm Kevin. If you don't know who I am, that's okay. A lot of people don't. I am a Microsoft MVP. My focus is primarily in .NET and Azure. I love everything .NET and Azure. I talk about it on the internet. If you like to talk to me later about Azure or .NET, you can talk to me in all the places that people can be talked to on. But we don't have time for that. I'll have this QR code at the very end so you can get it. Who out there deploys web apps? All right, I would imagine so. So we really don't need to go into the lesson here. The fastest way to deploy a web application is not doing all this crazy server-side rendering BS. It's just flat files. That is the single fastest way to deploy a web application. HTML, CSS, and maybe even a little bit of JavaScript. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. If we were talking Azure, I would talk to you, just throw it up on blob storage, just expose a file to the internet. And if you were running your own server, just expose a file to the internet. I'm going to talk to you about a slightly better way to do this. If you're on Azure, who's not on Azure? All right, Aaron, you don't count. Everyone else, I'm going to transition you to using Azure by showing you Azure Static Web Apps. So obviously, there's a lot of different ways to do this. So step one is you obviously need to build an app. Now, I'm going to build an app inside of a screen share. And what this is going to do, play. Oh, there we go. All right. All right, so while this plays, I'm going to talk. I'm using Astro. Who uses Astro? Or has used Astro? All right, doesn't matter if you use Astro or not. Who's used Next or Nuxt or Blazor? Pull it back to .NET. Specifically .NET Blazor WebAssembly. These are all different ways to build static web applications. Because if you've ever built on any of these different platforms, you can do npm build or yarn build, and it gives you a directory full of just static files that you can then upload to wherever you upload files to. I'm building an Astro site. This is going to be super simple, super straightforward. I actually thought I cut out most of the tedious stuff like installing dependencies with npm, but the end result is going to be a static web application, all said and done. So when you do this in just regular PowerPoint, you have a nice little bar where you can drag it to where you want it to be. You cannot do that in presenter mode. So everything's then done. You build the Astro site. Yay, everything's great. You go to the website. Boom, you get Astro. Cool. I want to take this site and I want to deploy it to Azure Static Web Apps. So first, we're going to create an Azure Static Web App. Now, if you're not an Azure person, you have no idea what this view is. It's like AWS, but way better. It's like Google Cloud, but way better. So go ahead and start the thingy. So everything in Azure starts inside of a resource group. You don't need to know anything about this. There's a nice little directory where you can go say, I want to build an Azure Static Web App. It says Static Web App. You go through a wizard. And the wizard lets you fill in all the different bits and pieces you want. First, you're going to set a name. What do you want it to be called? You get to pick a plan. Now, this is not intimidating at all. You have free or you have standard, and we'll talk about what the difference between them are in a moment. And then you pick where is your application hosted. So imagine most of us are on GitHub. Some crazy people are on Azure GitHub, DevOps, and then you have support for other platforms like GitLab and whatnot. Once you pick that, you pick your backend or your front end. So you can see we have a lot of support here. I did custom just because Astro's a little bit weird in some cases. But I'm going to pause it for, oh, no, I'm not. All right, lesson learned. Do not use videos in presenter mode. Okay, we're going to ignore this. You go through the wizard, it goes off, and it deploys your application. This is where that application exists right now. I'm going to get myself back over to, and I'm going to go to that site. Boom, Astro. Now, I'm sorry, I didn't get to show you all the little bits and pieces in between. When you create an Azure static web app, the first thing it's going to do is go off to your Git repo. So I'm using GitHub. It goes into GitHub and it installs a workflow on your behalf. So who uses Azure Functions or Azure GitHub Actions? All right, it's a GitHub action. This GitHub action, whenever you push up code, anytime you do a pull request, it's going to take your code, it's going to build it, and then it's going to do a super secret deploy to your Azure static web app on your behalf. You don't need to do any of this configuration. It does it all for you. So this is really cool because it means your app basically gets deployed immediately. What I'm going to do for funsies is, because I can control it here, I'll show you right here. So I said hit create on the web application. It's going off and doing the deploy. You get your portal. But then if I switch over to the GitHub repo, you go to actions, we have an action workflow of the deploy. So anytime you push the main, it runs this GitHub action, and this is doing all the build stuff in the end. And we'll talk through this a little bit more in a moment, but in the very end, we have a URL that shows our site. Now that's the entire talk. I'm done. I built an app and I deployed an app. That's literally in the entire talk, right? Done. So thank you. Standing ovation is welcome now. So, all right, there's more. Now I mentioned that there's different plans. 99% of you are perfectly fine with the free plan. It means it costs you absolutely nothing. You get your fully crazy fast web app that's deployed. You have a couple limitations, specifically around staging environments, which I'll talk about in a moment. They're really cool. And also like custom domains. Who needs more than 2 custom domains for any particular web app? You get crazy things like API management and authentication built in. We're not going to go deep into that because we don't have time. But then there's some other like enterprisey BS that you could get, like private endpoints or edge routing, which I don't need. But if you needed it, you could pay for it on the standard plan. Who wants to guess how much a standard plan costs? You know, get out of here. Like, that's the answer. All right, $10 a month, you can have a standard plan so you get all the enterprise stuff. I run one app on enterprise just because I need more staging environments, but everything else I run on free, including all my client applications. So that's really cool. Now, let's talk about staging environments, and let's make some changes. This app exists up in GitHub. I have the repo right here. Let's do clean. I'm going to switch back over to main real fast. Just make sure I have all the data. And we'll do a git checkout on a new branch. We'll call this I love Aaron. Just because you're here, Aaron, I have to do this. I'm going to switch over the cursor real fast. And we're going to find my welcome thingy. And I'm going to remove all the H1 tag and says, I love Aaron. Of course, I can't type for anything. It's like, you mean Astro? No, I mean Aaron. Aaron's wife. I've actually never met his wife in person, but I'm sure she's perfectly nice. Someone else is like, I choose Aaron's wife too. So real fast, we're going to do a commit, and we'll say, I love Aaron. We'll commit this up. So we'll do all the fancy Git stuff. Is anyone intimidated that I use Git CLI? Really? I'm sorry. It is the way. All right, so now if I come over to GitHub, it's going to say, hey, you have a PR. Let's go create that PR. I love Aaron. I'll create the PR. So we're going to sit here and we're going to wait just a second. Like this should take about 50 seconds. You see my Azure functions, GitHub actions are kicking in. And if we go watch what's happening underneath the scenes, it's all my PR. It's going to go off and pull down some GitHub action stuff. And it's going to build the app and it's going to deploy the app. But it's not going to deploy the app to my main production website. It's going to give me a special staging area just for this PR. All right, so it's going through, it's doing all the build stuff. Finish upload. So it's done, it's just in refresh. Hold on. Oh, there it goes. All right, so you see here I have a website. And I'm going to go to that website. If I go to that website, it says, I love Aaron. Yay, everyone's great. Now let's do a quick comparison. So this website, oh, that's not the one I want you to see yet. That's the main website. Yes, I know, go away. The website on the top is the main website. And then the website on the bottom is the branch. And so out of the box, they're going to give you this really weird, obscured URL that you can use. And what makes it even more obscure is you can see at the F dash. So the 4 represents the PR that I just created. So this is cool. I can iterate on this PR. I can do different changes, and just make everything look the way I want it to. And when I'm done, all right, there we go. I can go back to the PR. And, oh, CodeRabbit got its 10 cents in. What did CodeRabbit say? Oh, it's just a summary. Okay. I'm going to merge the pull request. And now that this is inside of master, 2 things are going to happen. We are going to run 2 different GitHub actions. The first one is on main. Main is going to go redeploy the main production app for me automatically. Now, if you're scared by that, you can put limitations on it. That's all in the GitHub action. The second thing that it's doing is it's going back to the branch and it's doing some cleanup. So it automatically turns off all of its staging environments after the PR gets pulled. That way you don't have things lingering afterwards. So we'll just wait a minute. Is this done? It's done. So if I refresh this, that web page isn't found. That staging site is completely gone. Yay. And now, I don't know if it's done yet. So yeah, it's not done. But here in a minute, we'll love Aaron. And all this stuff, you can just watch the GitHub actions if you wanted to see any progress at all. So in testing, this stuff takes like 20, 30 seconds. Of course, when I'm actually doing the live talk, it takes over a minute. I don't understand why. All right, let's refresh. I love Aaron. So now I love Aaron is live on. Yeah. Yay. Much rejoicing. All right. So that's staging environments. Let's talk about just some weird things that you sometimes want to do with static apps that you can't do through traditional deployment means. One is custom routes. So let's say I have this site and I want to create a custom route. So if I go to /Kevin, right? I don't want that to go to a HTML file. I want that to go to maybe Kevin's website, do a proper redirect. Well, because everything is HTML files or JavaScript files or CSS files. How do you solve that problem? How would you solve that problem? If I only support static files, how do you do a redirect? The easy answer is you create a file and you throw some JavaScript in there to do the redirect. So it goes, gets kevin.html, and the first line is what? Window.location equals whatever. Well, we could go into our static web app and we can go to routes. And I can tell the route, I want to add a new route. So if I type /Kevin and it's a GET request, I want to redirect that to consultwithgriff.com. And you can pick that as a permanent redirect or a temporary redirect. It doesn't really matter. You do all this stuff and you hit add. And what it's going to do, this is actually internal to the Azure Static app. This made an edit to my repo on my behalf. Specifically, it updated this configuration file that's in my repo, saying if you see a request to /Kevin and it's a GET request, you should redirect to consultwithgriff.com. Now, this is deploying, and just for fun, I came out here and I said, well, let me add CYC. So this redirects to commit your code. And this doesn't ever hit my site. It never hits a file. Static Web Apps is grabbing this on my behalf before anything happens. There are limits to this. I found out the hard way because I moved a site from an old domain to a new domain, and I was trying to set up the redirects for SEO reasons. Back when we cared about SEO, like we don't care about SEO anymore, but when we cared about SEO, I wanted all the redirects, and I put them all in this routes file. Turns out you can only have like 250 of them. Oh, ruined my day. I lost all my page rank. But that's a thing you can do. And when this is all done, I don't know if this is done yet. Yeah, it's done. So if we go back, we'll go back to Kevin, and this redirects to my web page. So cool, that's a thing you can do. Now, sometimes when you're building an application, you want to do slightly more than you can do with just static HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. Sometimes you might need to talk to silly things like databases, or you might need to go to Twilio or do something. It'd be really cool if you just had an API you could talk to, and we get that opportunity with static web apps by using Azure Functions. So I built a PR that exposes an API. Now, this API gives us a random John Wick quote. And the way it works is you go into your app, you create an API folder. Actually, I'm just going to check out into it. Git checkout, Node.js. We'll go in the cursor and show you up here. All right, so I have an API folder. If you put, sorry, that is super difficult to see, I apologize. If you create an API folder and you put code in it, you can build Azure Functions in Node.js and C#. I'm using Node.js just because I actually couldn't get the C# example to build. That's more a me problem than an infrastructure problem. It was just easier to build this out with Node.js. But all an Azure Function API is you have a function definition that says, when I get a request, a GET request to John Wick -quote, we want to execute this Azure function. This is a trigger, and we're going to have an action attached to it. The action is this little line of code. So if our endpoint gets called, it goes through, grabs a random quote, and returns a 200. You can have as many of these as you want. There's no limit on the number of Azure functions you can support, but this is a very basic Azure Functions project. And when it's under the API folder, why aren't you? There we go. when you run it in side of a PR, we'll go look at the GitHub action. It created a flow diagram for the thing. CodeRabbit's really cool. I like CodeRabbit. But if we go look at the GitHub action that ran, there is a very specific step. So this is a system called Oryx. It's all open source if you wanted to see how it works. But after it builds our static web app, which you can see here, it creates the static Astro site. It gets to a point down here at the bottom where it detects the API. Right about here. So it detects the API and it notices that it's Node, so it goes and does a Node build, and it deploys this to a special place where it can see the API endpoints. Now this is really cool because if I go to the site, this is the John Wick quote generator, it goes and gets a quote, and I can hit the button as many times as I want to. Cool. Every time, let's bring up developer tools. Let's hit a new quote. If I zoom in and look at the request, you can see it's coming from within my app. I don't have to deal with any pesky cross-site stuff. It's all the same origin, and this is great. Now, Azure functions are limited. It's easy to push simple Azure functions, Node.js or C#. If you want to get a little bit more complicated, there's mechanisms for doing that. So API options are obviously Azure functions built in. You can also bring your own containers if you have container apps. If you're running Azure App Services, you can bring those as well. And what's really cool is inside the configuration, those are separate web applications. They have their own URLs. They manage their own everything. But when you tie them directly inside the static web app, static web apps will use the same URL for them internally. So if your static web app is, or if your Azure App Service is mywebapp.azurewebsites, well, your Azure static web app uses the same endpoints. It automatically does the mapping for you. And that's a huge saving just because then you don't have to deal with cross-site scripting stuff. Who's dealt with cross-site scripting? Yeah, that's a pain in the butt. No one wants to do that. You don't have to. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we could talk about inside of Azure Static Web Apps. They're primarily geared towards more enterprisey endpoints. I'm not going to talk about application telemetry or anything like that. We could set up custom domains, just simply sending the DNS records. I do run my website on Azure Static Web Apps. This is great. This is a GridSum application. I have another app called Always Under Attack. We're recording. I'm not going to say anything. When the recording's off, I'll tell you more. But this is always under Cloudflare attack, and it's a Blazor WebAssembly application hosted on Azure Static Web Apps. And so it's all custom domain stuff. But this is a very good tool inside of my toolbox. Hopefully it's a good tool in your toolbox in the future if you're deploying any sort of static web application. But I'm at time. I'm happy to answer a question or two, and then I'll tell you all the secret sauce once the camera's off. Sorry, online folks, you should have came to the conference. But thank you all so much for hanging out with me.